Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning from Boston Harbor. Writing on the ruins of a defeated Italy at the end of World War II, Loris Malaguzzi, the father of the Reggio Emilia schools, came to see education as a project of nostalgia. A nostalgia not for the ruinous past of that fascism bequeathed, but a nostalgia for the future. He wrote, "We should think that we have a more need of being nostalgic, not so much about the past, but more nostalgic about the future. The children expect us in the future where our nostalgia now sees them." End of quote. The nostalgia for the future sees the work of education as cultivating the signs of healthy, flourishing, and engaged children. In the Platonic tradition, education endeavors to nurture that which is true, logic and science, that which is true, logic and science, that which is good, ethics and justice, and that which is beautiful, aesthetics. Creating a more humane, just, and sustainable world is education's urgent challenge. In the revolutionary words setting forth the goals for SDG 4, it reads, "We must ensure all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote its sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contributions to a sustainable development." End of quote. In his historic address at the Apostolic Palace on February 7th, 2020, the Holy Father, Pope Francis, shared with us, quote, "Concern for education is concern for future generations and for the future of humanity. It is a concern profoundly rooted in hope, and it calls for generosity and courage." I continue to quote the Holy Father. "In order to educate, one has to be able to combine the language of the head, the language of the heart, the language of the hands. In this way, the student can think what he or she feels and does, and feel what he or she thinks and does, and can do what he or she feels and thinks. By encouraging the training of the head, the heart, and the hand, intellectual and socio-emotional education, the transmission of individual and societal values and virtues, the teaching of a committed citizenship concerned with justice, and by imparting the abilities and knowledge that can prepare young people for the world of work and society, families, schools, and institutions become essential vehicles for the empowerment of future generations." End of quote. Basic education today is a normative ideal the world over. Prior to the pandemic, the enrollment of young people in primary education was almost universal. And very importantly, the gender gap has been significantly narrowed. Quality education is widely viewed as el camino real for sustainable development and a driver of wellness. I quote from David Bloom, who in his address at the Casina Pio Quattro shared with us, quote, Seen as part of the global commons, knowledge, learning, and education represent humanity's greatest renewable resource for responding to challenges and inventing alternatives. Ample evidence suggests that education, almost any form of education that nurtures and supports basic literacy, generates powerful virtuous cycle. Indeed, an education is perhaps the child's strongest barrier against poverty, especially for girls. Educated girls, I'm now quoting from UNESCO, are likely to marry later, have healthier children. They're more productive at home and better paid in the workplace, better able to protect themselves against HIV/AIDS, and more able to participate in decision making at all levels. Let me share that prophetically, Darwin, over 150 years ago, in a moment of feverish creativity as he was writing the notebooks, wrote in the margins, educate the girls, multiplication sign the number 2, double the impact. Prophetic, Darwin's take on the urgent importance of educating girls. The work of educating children and youth is culturally constituted, highly varied across societies, and ever evolving. Schools, while seeking nomothetic approaches, should reflect and reflect upon the cultural, environmental, technical, socio-economic realities of the communities in which they form an essential part. The curiosity and joy of learning at a young age opens the door to the gold standard of any education system, the molding of lifelong learners who have the tools and the joie d'apprendre to continue learning long after formal school stops. I give you Newton's eternal words. Here's the Newtonian theory of education. Quote, on the joy of learning and of the importance of curiosity, quote, I seem to have been only a little boy playing on the seashore and diverting myself in now and then finding a smoother paddle or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay undiscovered before me. The Newtonian theory of education is the tools so that children can get to the discoveries that lay before them in the great ocean of truth. Yet, the world is changing. We have seen the effects of COVID-19. In the largest school districts around the world, students from the most underserved communities have become education's desaparecidos. As their peers migrated to remote learning, hundreds of thousands of students are nowhere to be seen. COVID-19 has also foregrounded inequality as education's implacable foe. In the words of the eminent Argentine cognitive neuroscience, Sebastián Lipina, quote, different poverty indicators are associated with lower cognitive and academic performance during several stages of development. Psychological and neural evidence generated in recent years suggest a need to review all interpretations of the associations in the sense of deficit and consider the occurrence an adaptive process instead. End of quote. Concentrated poverty, deep segregation, xenophobia, thwart the opportunities for eudaimonic development and wilt the flourishing of millions of children the world over. Indeed, they represent the most significant undertow for us to follow the beacon set by SDG 4.7. Yet, 21st century's economies and societies are predicated on two fundamental paradigms: increasing complexity and increasing diversity, the twin corollaries of an ever more interconnected, miniaturized, and fragile world. We must mind the gap between what education is and can be with what education needs to be in the 21st century. On the ways each family is unhappy when it comes to education. If all families are happy the same way, in Tolstoy's unforgettable first line in Anna Karenina, here are the three most important ways in which we are unhappy qua education. First, quality education from early childhood onwards remains an elusive mirage for millions of children. Prior to the pandemic, approximately 260 million children and youth were not enrolled in schools, including over 60 million children in primary school, over 60 million in lower secondary school, and 138 million in upper secondary school. For those who are attending schools, the little education, especially in the form of literacy, will be vital, but perhaps not enough to thrive to their full potential. Too many children in low and lower middle income countries are falling farther and farther behind their peers in wealthier nations. According to research by the Center for Universal Education at Brookings, quote, at the current pace of change, it would take approximately 100 years for those farthest behind to catch up to the learning levels of those for whom the education systems are working well. Schools today are more unequal and more segregated, and the pandemic is dramatically intensifying pre-existing inequalities. The challenge is unfolding in high and middle income countries in the world in the context of another extraordinary formation, the demographic transformation, as the most diverse cohort of youngsters is making its way through education systems. In nearly every high income country in the world, schools are struggling to properly educate and ease the transition and integration of large and growing numbers of immigrant and refugee youth. The nexus between immigration and inequality is intensifying at a time when the children of immigrants and refugees are the fastest growing sector of the child population in a growing list of countries the world over. This morning, 2/3 of the children that woke up in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague will come to go to school, will come from non-Dutch immigrant and refugee origin homes. 2/3. In Stockholm, 40% of the children that woke up this morning to go to schools will be non-Swedish children and refugee and immigrants. In Berlin, 40% of the children that woke up this morning to go to school are non-German children of immigrants and refugees, not your grandpa's Germany. In the cities in the United States, in New York City, half the children today come from immigrant and refugee origin homes. In the second largest school district in the country, where Professor Wolf teaches, Los Angeles, 75% of the children, 75, come from immigrant, refugee, and African-American backgrounds, 75%. The third challenge facing schools is teaching and learning an ethic of care for our ever more fragile planet. The quest for a sustainable planet and a sustainable humanity must include cradle to grave climate literacy for everyone, including children in primary and secondary schools, college students, and citizens who become lifelong learners. Students are clamoring to learn science, to learn about the environment, to learn climate change, but we are failing them. Climate change education for all, carefully conceived, well executed, has inherent value, and furthermore, leads to measurable, desirable outcomes, including individual behavioral and attitudinal changes, resulting in reductions in carbon emissions of similar magnitude to other large-scale mitigation strategies. Here, I applaud the work of our Pontifical Academy of Sciences colleague, my former colleague at the University of California, Ram Ramanathan, taking the lead in the issue of climate change education for all in the state of California, in Sweden, increasingly around the world. Third point, the COVID-19 catastrophe. For millions of children, the COVID-19 pandemic represents a long-lasting, catastrophic education emergency, robbing them of the daily attending school rituals with all that entails, learning opportunities, socializing with other children, seeking supports from teachers, physical education, accessing healthcare and nutrition, and the various scaffolds needed for developmentally appropriate socio-emotional, cognitive, and metacognitive growth. The pandemic stunned education systems with geologic force. By early 2000, approximately 1.5 billion students were no longer attending in-person school, as school closings became mandatory in some 160 countries. And as millions of children will eventually return.
I beg your pardon, Professor, you have 4 more minutes.
Terrific, thank you, I'll be done.
Thanks for you.
Even today, millions of students remain unable to attend school. School closures disrupt immunization and other health services that are provided at school and prevent children from accessing the only nutritious meal of their days. The promise of new media technologies afford to reach and engage children who currently have little or no opportunities to them has been lauded the world over. Children in faraway places with little infrastructure can learn to read via creative new apps. The 2019 X Prize competition embodied one such endeavor. The 2019 X Prize awarded by Elon Musk, I disclose here that Professor Wolf and I served on the board of advisors to the prize, was awarded to K-Kid schools in South Korea, I'm sorry, and the 1 billion program in Kenya. A very elaborate and a very important initiative. The preliminary results are promising, though significant questions remain. These were apps to self-teach children how to read and how to write. Digital technologies, quote, if leveraged in the right way and universally accessible, can be a game changer for children being left behind, whether because of poverty, race, ethnicity, gender, disability, displacement, or geographical isolation. With strong media literacies in place, the new technologies can be a tool for what Pope Francis has called a humane globalization. Indeed, COVID-19 created great expectations that new media technologies will be deployed effectively to continue the education of millions of children throughout the world. But what we have learned is that the new media technologies have intensified educational inequities. Indeed, over a third of youth worldwide do not have internet access. Furthermore, new media are creating new concerns in a number of basic educational domains. Seriatim, long-term impacts of reading, the topic of Professor Wolf's presentation. Socio-emotional learning, the topic of the presentation by Professor Wolf's student in Israel, Tami Kazir. Cyberbullying, concerns that the new media undermine empathy, giving the children and youth also access to inappropriate materials, and lethally effective new tools for the exploitation and trafficking of children and youth. Lastly, the purposely designed addictive features found in new media platforms open another area of deep concern. So do the race of hate intolerance, and bullying through new information, communication, and media technologies. The effervescence over the promise of new media technologies and platforms in education has been tempered. While there are significant opportunities, the challenges are significant. Above all, and I'll conclude here, above all, 100 years of basic research in what we now broadly refer to as cognitive neuroscience, in the work embodied from Durkheim to Dewey, from Vygotsky to Piaget, from William James to Loris Malaguzzi, from Brunner to Gardner, to our own Marianne Wolf and her students, point to attested truth. All learning is relational, and hands-on, face-to-face, project-based learning is the gold standard for authentic learning and teaching. Peru, I conclude with the words of our colleague, Stefania Giannini of UNESCO. Through a humanistic and holistic vision of education and development, which cannot simply be framed in terms of economic growth, learners need the knowledge and values to live meaningful and purposeful lives in harmony with others and the planet. End of quote. Today, I invite you to join in Pope Francis' call for a global compact for education. I end with echoing the words of Hillel the Elder. If not now, when? If not us, who? Thank you very much.
Thank you.